Now let's talk a little bit about African American rights in the South. Before 1890, African Americans were still able to vote, but it was heavily discouraged by white Southerners, particularly members of the Democratic Party in the South, right? The Democratic Party pretty much ran the South. That's where the Democratic Party had its stronghold, right? And they wanted to weaken the African American vote. And so they did this through several different ways. One way would be redistricting. Okay, what is redistricting? Basically, it's when you change the district lines of certain areas so that there wouldn't be a strong African American presence and so that the African American vote wouldn't have as much weight. Also, in areas where African Americans were the majority, you would have local governments changing the nature of elected positions in those areas, right? So say there's an elected position in a county where African Americans are the majority of the population. Well, the local government could change the nature of that position to where it's no longer an elected position, but it's an appointed position where the government, the local government, will get to choose who fills that position. They get appointed by the local government, not elected by the people. Okay, so these are some ways that white Southern Democrats were able to weaken the African American vote. Plus, you still had violence, you still had intimidation. Now, there were some African American leaders, such as Booker T. Washington, who felt that African Americans should take more of a self-help approach rather than being dependent on the federal government to bring about equality in the South. All right. Washington felt that African Americans should pretty much accept segregation, not try to form political organizations or change things politically or fight for civil rights. Instead, African Americans should focus more on developing their own businesses or getting hired by white employers. Okay. He made the argument that since there was so much unionization going on, okay, where white laborers were joining unions and fighting for higher wages, then white employers would be more likely to hire African Americans because they would be more of a docile alternative, right? Where they're not joining unions and they're not fighting for higher wages, right? So he saw that as an avenue for employment for African Americans, and then African Americans could build up wealth, buy homes, buy land, and improve their communities that way. Now, you have some African Americans who decided to completely leave the South because of the restrictive conditions in that area, okay? And this would lead to the Kansas Exodus, okay? What is the Kansas Exodus? This is basically a period where about 40 to 60,000 African Americans left the South. They moved out of the South, hoping to have more freedom, be able to buy land, be able to live as self-sufficient small farmers. But unfortunately, it was more difficult than expected, because in Kansas it was hard to find work, and if you aren't able to raise enough money to buy land, then you can't buy land to become a small farmer. So many African Americans who were involved in the Kansas Exodus ended up becoming wage laborers there in Kansas. Now, beginning in the 1890s, you start to see a movement in the South develop to take away the right to vote from African Americans, okay, to take away the franchise. So this is known as disenfranchisement, okay? All right, so the disenfranchisement movement was a movement to take away the right to vote from African Americans in the South. All right, so how is this going to be done? Well, there's several different methods. There's a poll tax that was instituted in a number of southern states. So basically, if you're going to go to the voting polls and you're going to try to vote, well, you got to pay a tax first. And if you can't afford that, then you can't vote. And so this is going to discourage some African Americans from voting. You also have literacy tests that are going to be put as a requirement for voting. So in order to vote, you have to be able to read. You have to prove that you know how to read. You also, in some states, have to have knowledge of the state constitution before you can vote, right? So somebody's going to quiz you on the state constitution, and they're going to determine whether you have the right to vote or not. Then there's the grandfather clause. And basically, this clause is saying that if your ancestors could vote before the Civil War, right, then you don't have to do any of these requirements. You don't have to pay a poll tax. You don't have to take a literacy test. You don't have to have knowledge of the state constitution, right? Because your ancestors could vote before the Civil War. And so this is obviously targeting African Americans whose ancestors were enslaved before the Civil War, right? Trying to force African Americans to pay the poll tax, take literacy tests, etc. Eventually, the grandfather clause was found to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1915. and so that terminated that. But before that, the grandfather clause was making it more difficult for African Americans to vote in the South. And so ultimately, through the disenfranchisement movement, you're going to see the number of African American voters drop dramatically, right, after the 1890s.